on this episode of the WildFed podcast.
I really enjoy that intersection where humans meet the environment. You don't need a PhD to do this. Humans have been doing this for quite a long time.
A lot of the plants that human beings work with grow in areas of disturbance because human beings disturb the landscape. The urban environment is not just forageable, sometimes it's very forageable.
I like to think of it as democratizing health, democratizing food, and making it accessible.
Somehow we've arrived at glyphosate on the landscape's better than Japanese knotweed on the landscape, which is just preposterous.
The natural world has some pretty amazing systems of checks and balances. It is chaotic, but there is a method, and it's worth paying attention to.
There's going to be such a growing interest in this, and the people that we most need to get on board live in the cities.
Hey, nature is right down the street. It's around the corner and around the block from the convenience store.
Episode 157 of the WildFed podcast, Urban Foraging with Lisa Rose, is brought to you by Surthrival. Why just survive when you can thrive? Surthrival.com is your source for nature-based supplements that keep you thriving in our modern world. From hormone health to immune support, increased metabolism to exercise recovery, Surthrival keeps you thriving when others are merely surviving. Check out their Pine Pollen Pure Potency for testosterone support, colostrum for a smoothie ingredient that's 3 times more effective against flu than vaccines, elk antler for powerful growth and recovery, medicinal mushrooms for immunomodulation and powerful antioxidant capacity, and vitamin D3 for all the protective properties you heard about during the pandemic. Go to surthrival.com to see the entire lineup and use the coupon code WildFed for 5% off your order. Surthrival. Why just survive when you can thrive? Are you concerned about rising food prices and food security? Do you strive to be more self-reliant and live more sustainably? Learning to forage and grow your own mushrooms can help you take a leap forward in your food sovereignty. Mushrooms are nutritious, containing protein, vitamins, minerals, and a list of sophisticated medicinal benefits. And unlike other garden crops, you won't need a lot of space or time to grow an entire year's supply and save money on your grocery bills. You can even grow mushrooms in an urban environment, and if you know how to wild forage them safely and sustainably, you can get your supply freely off the landscape. Our friends at Wild Muskoka Botanicals have been growing and foraging mushrooms for over a decade and have put together a comprehensive online training. Avoid the most common mistakes when learning to grow edible and medicinal mushrooms. Learn the best techniques and species for your specific conditions and become more confident in your wild mushroom identification skills. They're currently offering WildFed listeners $30 off the course. Go to themushroomcourse.com. Again, it's themushroomcourse.com and enter WildFed 30 for $30 off, and take a leap forward in your health, self-reliance, food security, and knowledge of mushrooms. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. My guest today is Lisa Rose, author of the new book, Urban Foraging, Find, Gather, and Cook 50 Wild Plants, as well as a few other titles on foraging and food. Urban foraging, though it doesn't come up much on this show, has always been important to me. It's how I first started foraging, finding plants that grew in my backyard, snacks that grew up through the cracks in the sidewalk, or most importantly, harvesting fruits from neighborhood trees or abandoned lots around town. So I was glad to see that Lisa took this topic on, as it's a great way to introduce someone new to foraging without having to simultaneously immerse them in wild places that might otherwise add to the complexity of what they're experiencing or learning. Of course, urban foraging poses some unique challenges outside of just land use issues, and that has to do with contamination by pollution. But then again, we face similar threats at the supermarket, where much of the food has also been contaminated by dangerous and pervasive chemicals like pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides. I say that just to point out that in 2022, we have to be thoughtful about anything and everything we eat, no matter the source. But my conversation with Lisa also gets pretty philosophical too, too, because foraging, though intensely practical, is today something we usually do for reasons beyond the pragmatic. We take it on because it holds meaning to us. At least that, in addition to foods I can't get anywhere else, is what keeps me going out there to encounter species that live on the margins of our nearly ubiquitous human settlements. Though we as a species are swimming in excess calories today, relegating foraging to something of an anachronism, I'd argue that it's more important now than ever before. Not because we need to do it for food, but because food is the primary way we interact with other species. Because that's what food is after all. Other species. And when we interact only with each other and the suite of domesticated species we typically live amongst or eat, it becomes easy to forget that we share this planet with other creatures. Creatures much older than us or our way of life. Creatures that have been here all along. Food's our doorway to ecological literacy, and without that, our planet, I fear, is doomed to be simplified into, eventually, one giant dystopian factory farm, with humans as much the farmer as the farmed. So while much of the world sees foraging as a throwback to a time long past, I see it as a doorway to a better, more integrated, and more ecologically diverse future. That makes urban foraging a significant act, more than a hobby. It's an investment in a better world. Lisa Rose, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for hosting me today.
Hey, I'm sitting here with your new book, Urban Foraging, Find, Gather, and Cook 50 Wild Plants. I got the hardcover edition. Really lovely, man.
It is lovely. Thank you very much for taking a gander at urban foraging.
Yeah, I like the debossed cover, actually.
It does have a very good hand feel.
It
very good hand feel.
It does, yeah. Yeah, the pages are really nice as well. Hey, I'm curious to learn a little bit about you. I see that you have a background in anthropology and an interest in botany, of course, and ethnobotany. So curious to get a little of your background and how you come to the world of foraging.
Yeah, Great Lakes. I was born in Flint, Michigan. My journey has been pretty non-linear. Everywhere I've gone, I've been lucky enough to be connected to gardens, farms, people that know how to cook, eat, and enjoy the natural world. So across my career, actually a music school dropout, I stumbled upon anthropology and really enjoyed the double click into, just connecting to foodways across human history. And, for me, it helped really set the stage to make sense of, the current global environment, how we raise food, how we cultivate food, how we take care of our natural resources. And that's led me to a very interesting career, not just traveling and connecting with cultures around the world and how we connect to plants, but also, how our healthcare system is designed and how the result of our current food system is causing some challenges. So it's, again, nonlinear.
Yeah, we haven't even begun to see the challenges, I think. I mean, it's just, we're at the doorstep of it. It's very interesting to me that we go to food gurus and nutritionists before we go to anthropologists to talk about food. And I think that's odd because it's like, sometimes use this analogy in my lectures, but it'll be like, if you're going to bring an animal into a zoo from the wild, would it make more sense to talk to if you want to feed a chimpanzee, who's going to know better than maybe Jane Goodall? Like, would I go to the zookeeper and just check in? They might tell me like, oh yeah, this is the bag of feed we use. And it's like, but Jane Goodall knows what chimpanzees eat in the wild. So anthropologists know what human beings eat outside of our agricultural system and outside of our medical and nutritional system. Yeah. Yet we keep going to diet gurus who keep leading us on all of these weird tangential fad diets, and very rarely do we actually hear from people who've studied what human beings actually eat, if that makes sense.
It's a topic. I love that you bring this up. And for me, my upbringing, my father's an engineer by training. Like growing up in Flint, we grow cars in Flint. Okay, so, but one of the things that I was brought up with was a sense of curiosity and also appreciation for the natural systems in the world. And my dad and his father and my mother, there was always this belief, and my father would always say, the natural world is the best engineer. it has the best systems and should, looking to the natural world, that should inform us on how to, live our lives. And, for me, that was really, quite a profound, well, when you're 8, it's not really profound until you're older, right? But it was really the basis on which, even anthropologists, I'd say, look to a farmer, look to somebody that has a garden. They're going to really tell you how to connect, right? Getting into the field. You mentioned Jane Goodall. She was in the field and she continues to be in the field, right? She learned by doing. And I think that, it's the book Urban Foraging, as well as a couple other of my foraging guides and even the publications that the Timber Press is putting out. It's part of, and even your work as well. It's an effort to inspire people to get outside, pay attention, and start making those connection points, right? And understanding that our health today is predicated on the health of our soil, our water system. That it takes a long time, I think, to start to collect all of those experiences, but hopefully, our conversation today will result in people that just want to learn a little bit more, and to go direct to the source, in my opinion. Don't believe me. Go believe the worms in the garden soil, right?
Yeah, I think today it's really easy for us to say like, oh, so many people aren't really doing, they're just watching videos about it. But it's like, we've had that problem for a while because so much policy has been set, or so many products have been brought to market by people who are in academia or who are in business, but don't necessarily have a direct connection to the actual thing. So when we look at who's setting farm policy, or who's setting agricultural policy or drug regulation or whatever these things are, they're not people who are actually in the field doing. They're people kind of armchairing it.
Yeah.
And that's why, foraging is like this thing where you get it's just so real. There's like
no
denying anything, right? You're like really there with the plant. You're really doing it.
Yeah, and you touch on something too. There's a realness to it. There's also an accountability. You can't armchair it. It requires all of your senses, and it's empowering. Really, it connects. It allows people to become their own source of expertise. Right? It restores that power. I think that relying on, we could spend on a whole other segment, and maybe even like multiple dinners and fermented beverages, right? Talking about these layers. But at the end of the day, I can be outside. I can, use navigation skills to identify where I'm at. I can use what I put forward in Urban Foraging, a framework of decision logic, right? Is what's going on with the land? Where are things growing? Why are things growing in this way? Should I consider eating soil from this urban lot, or maybe I want to find a different spot, right? It's this decision logic and this framework that gives me just that sense of place to make decisions on what I can feed myself. Mm-hmm. Right. It's very basic. And it requires, I like to think of it as democratizing health, democratizing food, and making it accessible, right? You don't need a PhD to do this. Humans have been doing this for quite a long time.
Yeah,
right?
The whole time.
The whole time.
Mm-hmm, all the time.
So I really love how you're bringing up some of these elements that I do think about quite a bit, and hope to make a difference with my writings and work.
But it's almost like metaphorically, it's almost like with maybe like the Dark Ages church, where it was like this idea that you couldn't pray directly to your creator. You had to like go through a go-between. And that gave them a lot of power, right? So it's kind of like if you let sheep out of a pen and you're like, okay, go, make your own decisions, live your life. They're like, I don't know how. So sending people out, it's like, it's interesting because people are so used to all of, I always think back to this trip I took to Southeast Asia, and I remember going to a zoo, and they had a saltwater crocodile with like a 3-foot fence, and you could just climb over it if you wanted to. There was just no, not like it would be here, where they would be making sure there was no way you could get in there.
Yeah.
Like, you want to get in there, go ahead, And it makes you realize we get used to everything being padded and everything being safe and everything dangerous being locked up. And then, when it comes to food, you've seen it. I bet you hear, because I want to get into some of, in the beginning of your book, you've got some kind of basics on how to approach urban foraging, which I want to get into later. But I'm sure people are constantly checking in with you, like, well, how do I know? How can I? How do I? And it's scary for people to make these kind of decisions because they're used to farming these decisions out. In fact, it's not even fair to say farming them out. They were born into a system where all their decision making was farmed out already.
Yeah. I do love that you offer that grace to, what I would qualify the general public. We have, we've been born into a system where we're no longer using, I would say and I don't like to disparage common sense or disparage folks of like saying, well, we've lost common sense. But it's like the yogurt container. Is this bad? Should I throw this out? And it's like, well, just take a look at it. Give it a smell test. I mean, like there's some of these basic things, right? That it gets to be a little further out. And it's like, I can validate this is a crab apple. Will it kill me? And I don't, I want to always encourage people to ask questions because that's how we learn, right? But it's really nudging, I think, at the edges to make sure people want to learn or people feel excited to learn, right? There's also this sense of wonder and hope. And I think that because the topics that we're starting to dig into right now, these aren't exciting. I mean, they're not hopeful conversations, really, right? They're complex and they're challenging. And I think that some of those, to restore that ability to make the decisions or to open it up to somebody's, and it opens someone's eyes to say, oh, I can do this myself. Mm-hmm. Look at this. I can, like the joy, right, that comes from making your first, I'll use mulberry. Mulberry was one of the first pies I made on my own. My first apartment out of school. The mulberry bushes and mulberry trees are all up and down, where I grew up. And I just felt so proud of myself, even though it was a syrupy pie. It wasn't the best pie at all that I've ever made, but there was just that sense of self and pride that I can do this. I can make something delicious off of, with fruits that are just gathered, along this trail on the way to the library. Right. It's so, and it's like, oh my gosh, like this surprise and delight. And, I think that's the gateway. It's to really show people that they can do these things. And it's almost like feeling like we're 8 years old again, right? When things were magical. Like yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like acorn bread. I love making, transforming acorns into a delicious flour that I then use, in baking. And I'm not the best baker, but my acorn bread is solid. And like these kids, and not even kids, but like these old kids, like, our age are like, no way, there's acorns in this. And I'm like, yeah, there are acorns in this bread that I got, from my oak tree in my yard and they're like, no way. And then they taste it and they're like, wow, this is impressive. And, it just, that sense of wonder. I love that framing of it because it's so necessary to have in the days that we're living in, because that does lead to hope and joy and surprise and delight that you just can't get from doom scrolling on the internet, right? Like that's
feeling.
Yeah, like that's the antithesis of just surprise and delight and joy.
It's true. I'm raising a puppy right now, and so we had a litter of pups, and we're sort of down to the one we're keeping, and my wife and I. And the puppy is a lot like a little kid. Just it's always in that state of wonder. Like everything's new. Like I'll be like, man, he's only been alive 5 months. Like I keep looking at him and going like, Diaz, you don't even know what snow is yet. Like you think you've got a handle on life. You haven't even seen a whole year yet. I love that when you take an adult out to forage for the first time, you do see that sort of childlike wonder return a little bit. But I just want to kind of add one more piece is there is always those fears too. And you see stuff like a good example would be the movie Into the Wild, where it's like, oh, he ate a berry and died. It's like, man, that's a gross simplification and not helpful.
Hugely gross.
Not helpful. And the chances of you dying from, look, first of all, I'm not talking about mushrooms, all that aside, in the botanical world, not a lot of things that you're going to eat that are going to kill you that you could stomach or handle even having in your mouth for very long. And I feel like this stuff gets overhyped now. It's not that it's not true, but it's taken too far. So an example would be, well, like dogs are a great example. Dogs can't have chocolate. They can't break down theobromine and they will die. I have seen dogs eat so many cacao beans that it's like, look, if a dog gets your Hershey bars, it's like 2% cacao. Gonna be okay. Can it kill a dog? Yeah, but like you probably don't have enough chocolate on hand for that.
Right.
Similarly, like I have eaten gallons of chokecherry seeds raw, broken them up, eaten the kernels, never gotten cyanide poisoning. I know that can happen, but like you'd read these books and think you could do 2 teaspoons of them and die. And that is just, it's massively inflated. And I get why people do that. It's kind of like a parent trying, it's like that thing when, in the 50s where it's like, masturbation will make you go blind. It's like I get why people try to do those kind of things, but ultimately you find out there's no Santa Claus and you kind of feel like a little bit lied to. And it's like, were you trying to make me afraid of the natural world? Because, it's not that dangerous out there.
You touch on so many fun nuggets that we could unpack with this right now. And I think on one hand, right, from the evolutionary perspective, there is that that innate fear of the unknown, carte blanche, right? Like that said, the othering of the natural world has really done so much harm, right? Like it's just some of these basic things. Again, I'll go back to the yogurt example, the false construct of an expiration date in the grocery business, right? It's a false construct.
They have to put one on there. It's legally required. And you want people to buy a fresh bottle can package all the time.
Exactly. And I think that if you take that step back and say, why does this exist? And then also start to learn the framework, why it does in fact exist. Similarly, I think about the sassafras, and here in the Midwest, Great Lakes area, the sassafras is one of my favorite local plants here, that is up and down the lake shores of our Great Lakes. And, but it was declared a carcinogenic, I think it was in the late 80s. I'd have to go double check my facts because of the saffrole. And it's like, to your point, I'd have to extract the saffrole and really drink gallons of it. And here I am just making some root beer out of the young root bark, right? And
of a plant that has so much history of use.
Yeah, exactly. And so, again, to read the literature, to double click in, to some of both the ethnobotanical history, right? And the way that our studies have been conducted, they're not one-to-one.
And I wish I had a fact checker here with me on this one because this is coming out of my memory, so I could be wrong here. But I believe that some of that research might have been related to the drug war because saffrole is used in the production and the synthesis of MDMA. And so I think in the creation of MDMA and then the street drug ecstasy, that made saffrole sort of a prohibitive or a watch list substance. And so it kind of got demonized. Sort of, this happened to kava too,
Yeah.
And it's funny because now MDMA is going on in clinical settings to, save marriages and heal PTSD and all these kind of things. Yeah. But anyway, the plant remains demonized by it. And the other weird thing is we get this, so we get this sense of like, well, nature can be so dangerous. But when you start to look, you're like, well, for instance, you're from Flint, Michigan. Mm-hmm. And of course, we're all raised with, our tap water's safe though, right? Like that's gone through all of those safety valves. So we know that that's good. But water from like a spring, well, geez, I don't know. You're taking chances. Have you had it tested? Yada, yada, yada. It could be a spring that people have been drinking out of for 500 years. And people are like, I don't know. E. coli, it could have this, it could have that. Meanwhile, the stuff that's supposed to be safe are pharmaceutical drugs, glyphosate, all these kind of things that are all these food additives that turn out to be not carcinogens like what we find in some wild plants that there aren't enough concentrations of, but actually amounts, microplastics in our breast milk. It's like, don't worry about any of that stuff. Yeah. And you guys in Flint ended up with this very severe lead issue. And we don't see general warnings like don't drink tap water.
Yeah.
You just see like,
Yeah.
don't eat too much, don't eat sassafras or whatever. And that's really ironic.
I think you bring up the contaminated water, and this is probably, well, certainly it's multiple decades in the making. The Flint water crisis, which is being repeated. And it wasn't the first water crisis, right? We could go back to Aaron Brockovich, uncovering some of the earlier in the 90s, the earlier well poisonings and well contaminations and contaminants that are being found because of industry, right, across, honestly, North America and globally. So there are this fear. It's an interesting subject to unpack. I think when I think about living in the city, living in the residents in Flint. Over the weekend, I was just teaching in Stockton, California, at it's a 6-acre farm that's a community garden and surrounded by a very large industrial area and adjacent to a train track. And at the same time, you'd say, oh my gosh, nothing should be growing here, but humans are growing there, right? The 6-acre garden is growing there. Right. And this juxtaposition, I do have a history of an autoimmune disease. My family struggles with autoimmune diseases. I can't directly attribute it to, Flint or the PCB-laden beaches I grew up, foraging from. That's just not a direct connect for me to be able to do that. I'm sure it's affected my health. And as we look at epigenetics and really look at how the environmental pollutants turn on and off our biomarkers, like these are some really important connections that science is making. I am still going to eat the crab apple.
Little late in the game, unfortunately. Because we've been doing 70,000 new chemicals into the environment every year for so many years now, and now we're kind of it's catching up a little bit with and we're in this interesting point too, because we're seeing a lot of so there's major changes underway from a top-down level, UN Agenda 2030 and the World Economic Forum and stuff to radically change how we're living, which is something that needs to happen. But there's this sense of you're using too much of this. You've been doing too much of that. You've been burning too many of these things. It's hey man, these are things I never even wanted to be part of. This is the culture that these industries foisted upon us in this super profit-driven economic ecosystem. And then now we're kind of getting blamed for it. It's blaming the employees who were working the job that contaminated the water in Flint. It's well, I think it was the industry, that was responsible. What actually happened there anyway? I don't really know, what happened there.
So I'm not an expert on the Flint water crisis, the municipal, step-by-step that happened at both the municipal level and the state level. But I can say that, to your point, it is a systemic failure. It's a systemic failure. And I think that, and there's so many checks and balances that had been overlooked where, as a resident, one can't help but become despondent of, or not despondent, it's not the right word, but disenchanted with those that are supposed to serve and protect didn't, full stop, right? And how do you restore that trust? And I don't know where we're going to go from here regarding that specifically. But the community organizing that had come from the churches and the local neighborhood councils advocating for their own health, that's really where the drumbeat continued, to where the community's needs were elevated, right? And when I think about even foraging, it's I want to be able to trust in the infrastructure that we've had built. At the same time, I need to be able to make choices that I feel are safe for me. And I want to have the knowledge that can validate that those choices are the best choices for me. And, I think with Flint and with our food, again, I don't want to mistrust the water coming out of the tap, but also I'm not going to blindly trust that it's simpatico, and also I'm white and educated with a tremendous amount of privilege. So I know for a fact that even between the zip code I currently live in and the zip code next to me, we have very different garden spaces. Less trash in my neighborhood. Less. There is a higher level of lead concentration one zip code over, and I think that to be that advocate where I can leverage my my platform to give voices to those that might not have a pipeline, for lack of a better word, the ironic word, to share these concerns. Because if we don't really empower those of us living in the city with the knowledge and with the microphone, these gross, negligent activities are going to continue. And I think that urban foraging, again, hopefully, I dedicated the book to Flint, and not just her current residents, but those that had come before us, indigenous communities. We have a lot of work to do to reconnect all of these system failures so they don't happen again. And that's my hope. That's my hope with the book. It's a big, tall order, but got to start somewhere.
Yeah. And learning to forage is one of the things that's interesting about it is, being in the field that I'm in, I know a lot of people that forage. None of them are self-sufficient, food sovereign off of their foraging, but it doesn't, you don't have to be to get that sense of it, to start to get a feel for what it's like to take the brakes off a little bit or something like that, or take the blinders off. I don't know quite how to say it, but it's empowering. Yeah. You just might even know one apple tree, but it's like, man, that's food there and I know how to get it. And there's something about that, that real connection that is versus, because it's like, I remember when I first started to see barcode stickers on fruit, I remember just feeling like, it's funny how far the world's gone since then. Cause I remember seeing that then and being like, oh, what's happening? This is outrageous. Like fruits that have barcodes. But, so you pick a fruit that doesn't have a barcode on it. It's like, wow, that's pretty empowering. And you get to know one plant at a time. It's kind of like moving to a new town. You don't know anybody, but then you meet people one at a time and you nurture those relationships. So it's like you meet a crabapple tree, you nurture that relationship. Maybe you find a few, you learn a couple forbs, you make connections with them. Some mushrooms come out, you learn them. Like piece by piece, you develop those relationships, and that creates like a network. And now you're not alone. Because I have this sense that human beings are just fundamentally deeply alone on the planet unless we make these connections. Like we've always had these connections. You bring up the indigenous people of Flint. It's like the indigenous people there would have probably known something like, the average person would have known 1,500 species, let's say. And that sense of community, non-human persons that you would have known, in addition to all the people that you knew, you'd have felt very deeply networked into the world. But now we have humans who don't know anything but some cats and some dogs and whatever, like a couple, house plants. And so there's this sense of, as a species, we're like very alone. And I feel like foraging, outside of just the fun parts of it, the nutrition, that wonder we were talking about before, there's a sense of, I share the planet with other things. Because people give lip service to that right now. And there's all this talk about the environment, all this talk about saving species and biodiversity. But the average person, let's face it, unless they have some pursuit that brings them face to face with that biodiversity, it's mostly like a concept, not really like something that they have. It's kind of what we were saying in the beginning when we first started talking about sort of doing the real thing. It's like once you go experience that biodiversity, maybe you taste the biodiversity, then it's real for you. Otherwise, it's just this thing we talk about and it's so abstract. We'll get right back to the show in a moment, but first, I've got some good news about the WildFed TV show. You can now stream both seasons 1 and 2 on demand at myoutdoortv.com. That's myoutdoortv.com. My Outdoor TV is Outdoor Channel's premium online subscription service. They host thousands of episodes of hunting and fishing content, making this a great subscription service for anyone interested in the outdoors. But if you just want to see WildFed, grab yourself a free trial subscription and then check out all 20 episodes at no charge at all. If you decide to keep it, it's just $9.99 a month. We're currently in production for season 3 of WildFed, which should start airing around the beginning of 2023. Hey, thanks again for all your incredible support. If you haven't already, I can't wait for you to see the show.
You're 100%. As you were talking that through, what was coming to mind for me, I mentioned the sassafras, and maybe I was in my 20s. I don't remember how long ago this was, but it was like the first time where I could sense, I couldn't pick up where my person stopped, and the sassafras roots and the beach grass, like I felt connected. And that's kind of a little bit hippy dippy on a Tuesday, right? But there was a true sense of connectedness and a seamless connection where I think that unless it's tangible and it's made real for you, it is just hypothetical. And how can you protect what you don't even know exists?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right. And there's a knowing, and in English, we don't have the language to really break down, you can know something intellectually, but to know it deeply and intimately, they're two different things. And foraging, I do love, that one crabapple tree, nurturing the relationship one plant at a time. It does create that intimate relationship that is again, it's an adjacent benefit, I think, to what you were saying about the nutritional value. For me, I think sometimes people want to get super technical, and Lisa, can you tell me the carbohydrates or the plant proteins that you get from the nettles or from the acorn? And it's like, we could take these foods into the lab and do some analysis. At the same time, we're being reductionist in the same way we'd be reductionist for the food at the supermarket. Those 35 species, as opposed to the 1,500, we might not have known. Right? Like, and it's just like, you're missing it. Yeah. I love you, but you're missing the point. And, it's there's so many layers of this that we've sanitized for the commercial market. Right? We've sanitized literally everything. We've sanitized the soil. We've sanitized the fruit. We've covered it with 15 layers of wax when it arrives to us.
Sanitize the genome so that you're eating a clone of the same apple. It's like, I try to tell people sometimes, like, you've only eaten the same apple your whole life. You've only eaten the same banana, genetic clones of the same banana. Over every Cavendish banana you ever ate was a clone of every other Cavendish banana you've ever eaten your whole life. Mm-hmm. One banana. Versus like if we went to, like, let's say we went to Hawaii or somewhere where people can grow bananas, then every banana we eat would actually be different. Right?
And the rewilding. Yeah. I love, like, people, you can eat crab apples. I'm like, of course you can eat crab apples. Yeah, like, that's an apple. It might not be a gala apple, but it's some of the, it's an OG apple, folks. That's an OG apple.
That's it. Right?
And rewilding the palate too, because our tastes have, also become sanitized to sweet and salty as flavor profiles, right? You might have
those strong artificial flavors. Like, people have gotten really accustomed to, like, I'm thinking about like alcoholic ciders. Seltzers have become really popular, and they very often have all those. It's fake grape, it's fake strawberry, it's fake, and those flavors are so intense, and people kind of have gotten used to these, like, chemical flavors that they think of as tasting like fruit, but don't.
There's no taste receptor or a reference point for those flavors to hook into to qualify them as, left or right of center for grape, right? Right. Like, and, working, part of my background, I've been lucky enough to do a lot of work with food and nutrition education programs in our schools. This was in my 20s. And, children, it does take a while to develop a palate for something, 8 to 10 tastings to have something become familiar. Well, once something becomes familiar, or even before then, creating a language to talk about those flavors. Is it bitter? Is it a texture issue? Is it mucilaginous, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, not just Miss Rose, this is nasty. Okay, so let's say more about that, right? Like, is it spicy? Spicy is a pretty common one that comes up. Well, okay, let's unpack the elements of spicy. And so the wild foods, right, many of which are tannic or bitter or astringent. This is language we use to talk about wine or, beers. Correct. or tobacco, right? Like, those are elements that in the vernacular but we don't talk about them in terms of our salad plate, right? We don't talk about it in terms of, fruits that might come from all different places, or if you're going to make different teas or, different fruit flavors. And our brains really have been geared toward that sweet and salty flavor profile by the food industry, right? So if it's not hyper pumped up to taste, either one direction or the other, it is qualified as nasty.
Meanwhile, those things, the sweet and the salt in the food industry are also preservative. So it's like, a high sugar concentration starves something of water, and so does a high salt concentration. And so sometimes it's like they are very flavorful, but it's not even why they're in there sometimes. And then it's also interesting how older folks tend to, over time, because what I notice is people who taste wine keep their palate late into life. So like the older couples that I've known, for instance, who are really into wine, it's like they are still picking out flavors in their 70s, in their 80s, they're still able to identify flavors. But a lot of people, as they age, just get to where salt and sweet's all that's left for them, and it needs to be really intense. And so I often, and being on television, tasting wild foods all the time, I need to be able to describe these things. And I just noticed what you said too, like there's people's, it's almost like newspeak in 1984. It's like a diminished repertoire of words to describe flavors.
100%.
And then you'll get this thing. I noticed this because you brought up astringency and tannins. I almost always have lay people. I say lay people, I mean, that's not accurate, but people who aren't familiar with wild foods, or just maybe who don't do the flavor profiling a lot, almost always call astringency bitter. They'll be like, oh, that's really bitter. It's like, is it bitter though? Or is it just drying your mouth out? Because those are really different things, very different. In fact, one's like mechanical, not even a taste.
Exactly.
Astringent's not a taste, but people go like, oh, bitter. It's like bitter's become a generic word. It's like Smurf. It's like become a generic word for everything they don't like the taste of. And it's also really interesting to see what happens when kids get acclimated to bitter early on. Like the foraging parents I've got to watch sort of expose their kids to bitter foods. It's cool to watch how the kids grow up with a broader sense of what's palatable to them.
It is a very much so, I think, a practice that we can cultivate. Right. And part of it too, when you were talking about the tasting wine across time, like it's a practice. You can learn to experience that food and its flavors and how that food presents itself across the tasting, right? But it requires us to slow down. It requires us to be present and to really experience how it not only smells, it's multisensory, right? Yeah. So the aromatics that do come into this is also the biological role of taste isn't just your tongue, but it also is the aromatics that come through your nose, right? So and then also your eyes and, your hands and how it feels, and that multisensory, I think, approach to tasting food allows for that dynamic experience to exist, right? And across time. So you begin to approach your food very intentionally, or if you're gardening and then you watch from a multisensory, thinking about foraging, right? Like I can watch the weather right now, and right now we're in this really crazy, weird, low pressure system over the Great Lakes. And so I'm kind of watching it go, all right, so we've got actually some grapevines up north, and we're going to turn that into wine. And it's like, all right, when is it going to warm back up? And are we going to have an issue with molds and fungus? And it's this multi-sensory knowledge of how it's going to also affect the foods, right? That gets applied in different ways, that it's not on autopilot.
Right. Or it's not a thermostat that you set. Because like you're bringing up, the built environment's interesting where the floor is always flat. So you never need to really tune into what your feet are telling you. Versus, if you're out walking on a beach or you're walking on rocks or something, your feet are like your hands, incredibly innervated, right? So yeah, they're communicating a lot of information about the surface. Is it wet? Is it dry? Is it crumbly? Is it slippery? Like you're getting all that information, but we don't use that because we don't need to, because our surfaces are flat. We don't have to thermoregulate very much because we keep our spaces always at 65 degrees, and they just stay there. And the night is the same temperature as the day, which is a radical departure from the natural environment. High and low pressure is another great example, because that's something once you tune into, you can just feel. Like I can feel when the pressure's 100%. Dropping, right? But but honestly, I didn't know that till I had a barometric watch. And then I was like, I see now, like what that's why I can feel that. So you can start to tune into all of these things, sort of like you're saying with flavors, and you realize too, it's cool because you have chemoreception, right? It's like your body has the ability to relay information about whether something's safe to eat or not.
I think that again, it's practice. It's the first couple times it's going to be unfamiliar, right? It's that it's going to even maybe be perceived as a threat. Oh, this is uncomfortable. It must be unsafe for me. And I think creating that experience in a safe way for people and helping connect. That's why I love teaching from a garden setting. It's safe.
Yeah.
There's a perception of control. The natural world is chaotic, right? It's like there's nothing orderly about this low pressure system that we're sitting beneath today, like in the Great Lakes. It's beautiful, but it's not predictable. And, creating those experiences and this is where even from an urban foraging perspective, or working again with kids that, I work with so many kids that have never been out to Lake Michigan, or, just coming from the Bay Area. I've done a lot of teaching, I can guarantee a lot of the kids that I worked with over the weekend have never been out to the Pacific Ocean, right? High likelihood. And, you can't be what you don't see. Right. Right. And so for me, there's just the work is really about creating those aha moments. If you don't have the privilege of going into BLM land or backcountry, I think my drive to write urban foraging really is to continue to nudge at the edges to say, hey, nature is right down the street. It's around the corner and around the block from the convenience store that's only selling spicy Cheetos. And look, there's also wild mint growing. And look, I can make bread from the acorns that are falling from the trees. And again, to just sort of keep nudging at the edges of people's curiosity. And I do love, even the barometric watch. I mean, if that's what piques the interest and gets people making the connection, I'm fine with that, right? It's like we can use a multitude of approaches to meet people where they're at and to draw them in, so they become more and more connected to some of the natural biorhythms that govern our world.
Yeah, because I think outside of satire, it's probably pretty useless to guilt ourselves or shame ourselves, or especially to shame others for what we don't know that we used to know as a species, because we're so removed from the natural world. So it's like, you can't feel the barometric pressure change. It's like, well, like we end up using tech. So it's like, how many of us use apps on our phone, or we use, to find our way back to these things. Yeah. So yeah, we kind of have to at this point. But the urban foraging piece is fascinating to me. It's something I've always loved to do. And I have found that it's like a lot of people. So I live in Maine, and my home is in an area that's largely a hemlock forest. Mm-hmm. People would think, like, who don't know about it would think, oh, wow, the foraging must be awesome. It's like, no, it's terrible.
No, it's not. You got some reishi mushrooms.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, exactly. You know how it is. I got some, like, wild cucumber and that, and then those few things. Like, not much in that ecosystem. Then you start getting out into the marginal areas around built environments, and you start to see, especially annual forbs.
Yeah.
So many, because a lot of the plants that human beings work with grow in areas of disturbance because human beings disturb the landscape.
Yep.
So therefore, it's like I use this plant to make hand drill fires called horseweed. I find the nicest specimens in abandoned lots in my town, not the ones that grow in my yard. It's like areas of disturbance. And so very often, of course, there's lots of exceptions to this, but the urban environment it's not just like forageable. Sometimes it's very forageable.
Yeah. I'm simpatico on that with you. And I think you also have, and we've, as humans, we've ported around the plants
right
from across space and time, right? So I think of garlic mustard. Yes. Can it take over, as spaces very rapidly? Yes. That's part of its, biological, forte, right? But, I think that when we look at these plants that have been, carted around by humans, the plantains, it just, the diversity around where we've disturbed soil. Also then, the edges of the woodland, the berry bushes and, the trail sides, the feral apples that might be left behind from a farmstead. That might just be the anthropologist in me that finds it all attractive, because it's a data point of what's happened in a place across time, right? And because I'm always asking myself, what happened here? What's going on? Like that's just who I am by nature. Not everybody's going to stand here and want to, double click into the railroad tracks or any of that, and how it's connected to the history or prehistory of what's going on in a space. But I really enjoy that intersection of where humans meet the environment. And Gary, Indiana is one of my favorite places, probably in the United States. And people would be like, yay, PCBs, awesome.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating. It's fascinating. And how then also nature restores itself, right? Yeah. So when we, like Hurricane Katrina, taking out large sections of New Orleans, like some of those habitats have come back in extraordinary ways, after some really tragic experiences for the humans that were there.
Chernobyl.
Chernobyl,
looks pretty good. I don't necessarily want to forage there, but it's pretty impressive the way the wildlife appears there now,
Yeah, and nature, it goes back to, my father's POV that, the natural world has some pretty amazing systems of checks and balances. It is chaotic, but there is a method, and it's worth paying attention to. And it's certainly never boring. There's never a dull moment when you connect to the natural world and just start asking why and having that sense of wonder.
Yeah, year round too, which I like that you touch on this in the book about how foraging can be 4 seasons, because I think some people don't really see it that way or don't imagine it to be that way. But I like that you talk about that. I also want to hit on, you were sort of talking about plants that we've carted around the world. And, sometimes it's funny, you hear, I think the classic example is the Japanese knotweed. And you always hear planted for latrines because it grew fast and could kind of cover those areas. And, you hear those kind of stories, but now the plant's out, right? It's like out of the bag. And it's become so demonized. And we use this language of invasive and non-native and deleterious and all these kind of things, and we start to demonize the plant. And it's like, well, dude, we brought it, but that's led to an industry where we then think the solution, like somehow we've arrived at glyphosate on the landscape's better than Japanese knotweed on the landscape, which is just preposterous. But it means that as foragers, and in particular as urban foragers, we have to be pretty savvy that this is going on, because, and there's actually 2 sides of this for me, because one side of me says, well, dude, if you go down to the supermarket and you buy some corn, guess what? There's glyphosate on that too, right? It's like, it's not like
it's a paradox.
In fact, they've genetically modified it so it can handle, you can spray even more of it on there. But regardless, like, we have to know that this stuff's happening. So, the urban forager needs to not only think, hey, has this area been sprayed or treated in some way? But even further than that, what was here before? Like, I moved to the town where I live now, sort of as part of the gentrification of that area. And I've got a local neighbor who grew up there. And sometimes he'll tell me, like, dude, just so you know, that spot over there is like basically a super fun site. You do not ever pick anything over there. And it looks great. And he's like, yeah, but there was a auto body place there that poured its oil on the ground for 15 years. Like, don't touch it. And so we have to be, urban foragers need to be a little bit of an investigator in order to know what the area's been through that they're harvesting from. I was just wondering, you must just, having put this book out, must be overwhelmed with people asking you these questions constantly. Like, how do I navigate that?
I love that people are asking the questions, right? Because it's all of a sudden they're curious, right? To your point on the super fun site comments, I mean, the place I was like out for a picnic on my birthday weekend, my husband wanted to go to the beach, and I'm like, could we stop by the railroad tracks so I could like walk? And he's like, sure. And for me to share with him, the significance of the site, it was previously a large paper mill site that, has been under transformation, large in part, under the direction of the EPA. But for folks to start to ask these questions, well, how long will these chemicals last? Like that investigative reporting, so to speak. I think, again, it leads back to, you can't be what you don't see. You can't be an advocate for the environment in your community if you're not provided that opportunity. And I think that, getting some of it does seem, again, it's like 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Do I eat from the park that's, the edges of the park have been sprayed for the knotweed, or do I, eat, the conventional produce at the supermarket? Honestly, I think both can exist. I think both can coexist. I would like to change both, ecological frameworks. I loved what you said earlier about making that connection one by one to plants and having a relationship, because you can start to have a relationship with your park management team, right? In your neighborhood parks. I work very closely with our parks and rec teams across multiple counties. And, I view it as a people and plant partnership. I don't want to shame, you brought this up as well, shame or land blast. That gets no one makes friends that way. Right? Like, you don't feel safe. It's not a safe relationship. If you're a parks person, you want to also be engaged and curious about how you can be a better steward for the resources that are under your care, right? And so there is always that opportunity to have a conversation. And none of this work can be done by one person. It requires connection. And I think that as we struggle and wrestle with these very big conundrums that we've kind of backed ourselves into, we need to have some grace. I really do appreciate, and I'm deeply grateful for the way that you come to the conversation with that, with grace and compassion, leading the conversation, because frequently that's not what it is. It's a very combative, like us and them. I can find myself in a very critical, mindset, toward the institutions that have led us down this path. But at the same time, our institutions are made up of people. How can I affect change and make a better connection by resetting that, that mindset, right? Take a step back. There are humans at the table for this. How do we work together and move our work forward in a way that does benefit the plants and the people?
Yeah, grace is a cool word. I really like it because it's, as I understand it, it means unmerited favor. So it's like, I need grace for things that I don't deserve it for. So it's like unmerited. So the idea like that creator gives you grace, it's not that you deserve it. It's just that it's freely given. And so sometimes people are guilty of things and you can still give grace. It doesn't mean, it doesn't let anybody off the hook.
Correct.
It's just
Yep.
like, hey, you got one too, so do I. Like we all got stuff in our stories, skeletons in our closet or whatever it is. Like we're
not
just
perfect.
Yeah, we need to kind of we all need to give each other, cut each other a little slack here, and be a little more kind and a little more compassionate about these things. And also to your point about the combativeness too, it's like we're not foragers are not well represented currently, I don't think, and in the conversation as stakeholders. So like you developing those relationships with the park and rec, or here I'm constantly developing relationships with the inland fish and wildlife. Then they know we're stakeholders. And maybe at first they don't take it that seriously, or it's not that important, or we seem like a very small percentage or whatever it is, but that's how you start. And then over time we get brought into conversations that we're not currently part of, or our needs are not being considered in the bigger conversation. So having those relationships is really, really important. And then also having those relationships like you're hinting at too with the plants. Like one of the things I just love you find kind of, and you'll know this from anthropology, it's like there's so many universals that, you look at indigenous cultures around the world and you find like they are radically different in culture, but then there's so many overlapping worldview kind of things. And one that's very common and that is lost in our reductionist way of looking at things is to give personhood to other species. We just tend not to do it here, but I think one of the things that's transcultural prior to probably the Neolithic Revolution is this idea that these other species have agency. And in fact, most of them have been here a lot longer than humans.
Oh, yeah.
So sometimes I feel like I'm an ambassador. It's like if I talk to a warden and I introduce him to a plant, he's like, what are you doing out here with this? And I introduce him to the plant. First of all, usually they think that's pretty cool and they're interested. But also then I become an ambassador to introduce them to someone they don't know. Maybe it's wildlife, and it's like, hey, I want to introduce you to somebody. That's how I think.
Yeah. No, that's rad. I love that.
It's like a friend of mine, somebody I rely on or whatever. So,
I think by default that resonates with me because I think that, my kids now are older. My son, he's now 20, and my daughter, she's 17. But in those middle years of like teenagerism, like I sing to plants and I'll have songs about mullein and, just, right? Like, oh my gosh, here goes my mother again. She stopped singing to the, you're just like, but I do sing to these beings that are around me, and they do have their own, proclivities. They have their own personality to me. And again, this now goes way off anything that's either academic or, scientific. Rather, this is the personal relationship I have with the ecosystem around me and everybody that lives in it.
Yeah.
And it is that personification. And, it's just kind of like cultural literacy and deconstructing race. It's like, you got to get to know somebody to help reduce this misconception or a misconception or right. We're kind of talking about similar things in parallel, right? Getting to know other cultures, getting to know other plants, it's just all about getting to have an intimate relationship and a better knowing of just those living things around us, whether it's rocks, water, plants, people. And then we offer a deeper grace and compassion, and extend it and have it extended back to us, right? Like that's what we want. We want to be treated that way. Actually, nature probably doesn't care as much about extending that back to us.
Gives you a chance, equal opportunity.
Right? It serves up some opportunities, but it does have a limit.
It's interesting with the, like earlier you were talking about the reductionist approach, like, well, what kind of oils are in it? What kind of proteins in it and stuff like that? And so imagine like, you introduce me to your kids and I go, oh, your kids are amazing. What percentage of water are they?
Right.
Like what percentage of amino acids are your kids? And you're like, no, I want you to meet my actual kids. It's like, I want to introduce you to mullein. Well, what percentage of protein is it? It's like, no, you're missing the point. Like I want to introduce you to the thing, like as an individual. And that can be hard for us because we're used to looking at that's the biggest challenge. We look at the entire planet as resources to be broken down into constituent parts. And then we start to think all the parts are fungible. So and they're not. And it's like, I can't swap, arms out on your two kids and just swap them around. It's like, it doesn't work like that. Their parts aren't fungible. So we need to look at things more holistically. And I think sometimes about how, if you look at the eyeballs and you follow the optic nerve, they're connected to the brain hemispheres. And you got these two brain hemispheres. And I apologize to the neuroscientists out there, but like, if I was going to simplify it, you've got a left and a right hemisphere to kind of view the world from two perspectives. And we're at this time now where it's like wrong to view through one lens. So you're kind of calling it the hippy dippy lens. It's like, that's a real lens to view through. And the academic one's a real lens to view through. And when I close one eye and I look at something, I don't have any depth perception. But if I have both eyes open, those two slightly different views overlap and give me a real three-dimensional view of the thing. So it's unfortunate people think you're supposed to be one or the other. So we get these dry academics who refuse to allow a sort of knowingness and feelingness in their world. And then you've got the hippies who are like, no, you're reducing everything to math. It's like, dude, math's real. So we want both. And that gives us that binocular vision gives us a three-dimensional view of a thing, and we can see something holistically. But when we use one or the other only, we're not really seeing things as they are, I think.
I think I love how that's been framed by you. And it is something that I've grappled with, I think, across my career, trying to fit into a very binary world, right? You're either this or that. You're either an anthropologist or you're a writer or you're I'll even say scientist. For the scientists, they don't necessarily struggle with the anthropologists, right? There's this very binary approach. And I do believe that each of us brings a perspective and a way of seeing things that adds a depth and a clarity that wouldn't exist, with just one lens or approach. And I think that the world could benefit from adopting that framework to have conversations around these really complex, big, ugly challenges that humans do face. Because yes, we want the maths at the table. We want the sciences, the geologies, the biologies, and then the artists and the creators of, beautiful, actually, I feel my mathematicians are our artists, right? Like they're the same thing. Yeah. And this has, and this all translates into, creating a new way forward, which I think too, this book kind of came out of, it was really hard to write during the pandemic because like the rest of us, I was sort of, gobsmacked, like the rest of the world, like, oh my gosh, we're in this huge transition. Thank goodness my relationship with plants helped lead me through it. And we're still continuing through it, right? And what are we going through to? How can we co-create a new book together that allows for those different perspectives and recipes and recipe shares? So
yeah, and I just think there's going to be such a growing interest in this, and the people that we most really need to get on board, I think, live in the cities. They're not the people in the people in the rural environment are already doing a lot of these kind of things.
Yeah, I would agree.
It's the people in the urban environment who, it's like when you look at voting, like where's the most power lay? Well, it lays in population centers because there's so many people. And when it comes to how dollars are spent, or when it comes to how products move, or whatever it is, it's like everything's driven by these dense population centers that are getting denser. And people learning to, like you said it earlier, that nature's not just, out in those rural environments. It's like actually your city's like built in nature. It's like part of nature. All the parts came from nature. It's like, it's right here. So people, I feel like if people, it'd just be really cool, the renaissance that could happen if people appreciated the nature in the urban environment. And you're starting to see it, of course, especially in a lot of the more sort of, progressive areas of the world where there's integration more and more, but we're still talking, it's like a very small percentage. So I just feel like people getting out to forage in what open spaces and green spaces they have, which sometimes is a crack in the sidewalk. I mean, I remember it being a little kid, a little welfare kid, like living in a real poor area, like eating shepherd's purse seeds out of the cracks in the sidewalk. And, not just instinctively being like, oh, that's kind of peppery.
Yeah.
That little crack in the sidewalk, it's like a Dixie cup of soil or something, but I had a connection there, and that made me appreciate it. And I've carried that with me. And so I think that it doesn't have to, because you brought before, like, no doubt there's a massive spectrum of access out there. Some people, it's like, oh yeah, I'm going on 3 weeks backcountry deep into national forest, elk hunting, and I'll see you in 3 weeks. Other people are like, just have that crack in the sidewalk, right? Like, people have different access. But what's exciting to me is people learning how to utilize what they have, in addition to obviously, creating more equitable world. Like right now, first thing, I really want to see people connect. I feel like your book is going to help people do that. Because what do you have? 50 plants in here. And so many of these are so common, it's so accessible. In fact, people are walking by them every single day, right?
Well, I think I appreciate that you recognize, that you offer that back to me. I did, want to make sure that the plants did cover a broad number of bioregions, right? And, this morning I had a chat with Santa Fe, and, their bioregion is markedly different than, you in Maine or me in the Great Lakes, but also there's some really fantastic commonalities. Yep. So that's something I've wanted to make sure, first and foremost, that I could cast a wide net and reach folks and to get them excited, and to inspire other people to continue to ask questions, and then those concentric circles, right, to kind of ripple out and continue. I only have so much reach, right? And it's through conversations with you that we reach more people, especially, in, like you said, our urban areas. We need to be those advocates. And I love the word that you used, ambassador. I think that not just ambassadorship can we play, but also elevating, and promoting other people to be, ambassadors in their circles and networks, and to build up the equity in communities that have been overlooked or bypassed, that wouldn't necessarily have that luxury to go out to the national park or to live backcountry for 6 months, or go on an exotic hunting trip, right? That's something a very privileged group of people really have access to. So I'm excited and crossing fingers it makes the impact that I hope it can make.
Yeah, and the other thing is, like, you don't want to get into that mindset. You see this with people who, let's say somebody's like a real kick-ass in business, but they're a workaholic, and they tell themselves they're going to appreciate their home, they're going to appreciate their family, their kids, their husband or wife or partner, or they're going to appreciate their life more when they get to a certain number in their bank account, or when they get to a certain level on the ladder they're climbing, but not yet. Right now I need to focus on the work. And I don't want folks to say, well, one day when I get out of this city, one day when I get there, then I'm going to do those things that I want to do. And that's what I like about this. It's a kind of an approach where it's like, hey, in the meantime, get at this, or maybe you're staying there, get at this. Like, it's there, it's accessible to you. That's the thing, is like, we'll have these conversations, let's say, about like privilege, like, but at the same time, like, everybody has access to something, even if it's not the same. There's something out there. So in the meantime, because that's just so much work to be done. In the meantime, like, let's make sure we utilize what we have, because we all have some kind of blessings, and like, let's put those into play while we have them.
Well, I feel that way about the oak tree and the acorns that fall just with abundance, and it's, for me, I can become a pessimist, or in, a very scarce, walk around with a very scarcity mindset, particularly after doom scrolling on the internet. Okay. Like, oh my God, but then I recalibrate that by remembering, or if it's during the fall season, going out and gathering the acorn. I'll just use, for example, because it falls in such quantity and abundance, thankfully, that it reminds me that nature, I have all I need.
Yeah.
I really need no more, certainly. and I could do with a fraction of what I have. Mm-hmm. And that scarcity mindset is also a construct, I believe, that we can not only change, but I think, again, recalibrate to say, okay, nature has provided us. This is enough and we have enough. And how do we share more? How do we, open that aperture up a bit more and recognize the tools that we have, and then also continue to be that ambassador and advocate to regrow those natural spaces that, the little Dixie cup of soil for the shepherd's purse. How do we advocate for more Dixie cups of soil?
And in the meantime, like you said, I mean, just thousands and thousands and thousands of tons of protein and carbohydrate and lipid-rich acorns are falling on the ground year after year after year. We're talking about people going hungry and food shortage and all these kind of things. And it's like, man, there's a lot out there. It's how that mindset that we're approaching the world with, that aperture. Yeah.
Lockdown happened and I was able to walk down to my gully and gather the nettles. And
yeah, exactly.
Granted, I knew enough not to use it as toilet paper when the world was going on a toilet paper shortage.
But you knew about the mullein.
I also knew about the mullein, which is also not toilet paper. Okay, if you have women bits, it's not comfortable.
It works great for me, though.
There you go. But yeah, it's a blessing to have that knowledge, and I am excited, and hopefully we can talk again and share maybe recipes and exchange, tips and tricks, in addition to, I think
we went to 50,000 feet pretty fast.
We did. It was great because I don't always get to go to 50,000 feet. And sometimes people are like, keep it at 8. Maybe we only can go to 2,000 feet.
Yeah, no, I think that I really like the, we do so much like of the tactical component with the show too. And I love doing that, but it's so interesting to me, like what drives people to even be part of this. And also when you start to dig into the philosophy, you realize like that, despite what people wear on their sleeves, like most of us feel pretty similarly about things,
Yeah,
I just think
100%.
That's fascinating. Like it's just interesting to me because things have gotten very divisive, but I think that most of us in our hearts were pretty similar. It'd be nice to get focused on that again, So,
well, that fuels that does fuel my work, and I think to keep that front and center as I go forward with future conversations, I think that I appreciate your gift of time and perspective, and I hope I can come back and we can continue the conversation.
Next time we'll talk spades and baskets and
heck yes. We'll have to make like a sticky board where we can just like kind of pull things down, or like a roulette wheel of conversation.
I want to do a
topics.
roulette wheel, yeah.
Right? No, that's good. That is much more
fun than a whiteboard. Lisa, thanks so much for your time today. Well, I'll give you a second just to tell people about your social media, anything you want to say about your book and how to get that, all those kind of things.
Well, as much as I like to be outside most of the time, I'm also on those social channels. So the Twitters, the Facebooks, the Books of Faces, the Instagrams. I'm probably not as up to date as I should be with all of my sharings of the musings, but also some of my all the right. It's like
you're doing your job.
Yeah, exactly. But also some of my musings are on a website, author lisamrose.com, and I do welcome folks to connect because this is the best part of the work. Right? It's nice to have recipes, shares, but it's also more for me. It's more satisfying to build the relationships and to build that network of foragers and wild food people and just good overall humans, because it makes me have a sense of place in the whole order of things. So I hope you stay in touch and your audience reaches out as well.
Awesome. Lisa, thanks so much.
Thank you. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. You can help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh new content. Have a podcast guest or topic suggestion, or maybe a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host the WildFed TV show for? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. If you still haven't seen season 1 or 2 of the WildFed TV show, go to myoutdoortv.com, grab yourself a free trial subscription, and then check out all 20 episodes. Season 3 of WildFed premieres on Outdoor Channel in early 2023. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out our store for WildFed shirts, hoodies, hats, stickers, and more. WildFed. Food is all around you.